Today, we wrap ourselves in synthetic insulation rated to specific temperatures, sleep in climate-controlled buildings, and still complain when the thermostat drops a few degrees overnight. The mountain men of the 1820s had none of this, and they slept outdoors through Rocky Mountain winters, where January temperatures averaged 7 degrees and regularly plunged far below zero. Their shelter was a lean-to built from forest materials in 90 minutes. Their sleeping bag was the hide of a buffalo, brain-tanned to supple leather, weighing more than 20 pounds. Their heating system was fire, but not fire as most of us understand it. They knew something about where heat goes and how to capture it that we've almost entirely forgotten. For 20 years, ordinary men survived conditions that would kill most modern humans in hours. This is how they did it. Picture a January night in the Rocky Mountains. The year is 1836. The temperature has dropped to 15 below zero, and it's still falling. Snow lies 3 feet deep across a landscape so remote that the nearest permanent settlement is 600 miles away. And somewhere in the Wind River country of what would one day become Wyoming, a man prepares to sleep outdoors. Not in a cabin, not in a tent. In a shelter made of sticks and pine boughs, open on one side to the winter air. He has no sleeping bag, as we would recognize one. No synthetic insulation, no vapor barriers, no emergency blankets. What he has is a fire, a wall of green logs, and something that weighs more than 20 pounds wrapped around him, the hide of a buffalo, tanned with the animal's own brain, thick with winter fur. And somehow, this will be enough. Somehow, this man will wake tomorrow, shake the frost from his beard, and continue his work in the wilderness. He'll do this night after night, through the coldest months of the year, in one of the harshest winter environments on the North American continent. The question that hangs in the frozen air is simple. How? How did mountain men survive conditions that would kill most modern humans in a matter of hours? What did they know about fire, about shelter, about the physics of heat and cold that we've forgotten in our world of central heating and down jackets? The answer lies in an elegant system of practical engineering that most of these men could never have explained in scientific terms, but understood in their bones. It begins with something as simple as where heat goes when you build a fire, and why almost all of it, without the right knowledge, goes to waste. To understand how mountain men slept through Rocky Mountain winters, you first have to understand the world they inhabited. And that world was nothing like the wilderness most of us have experienced. We think of camping trips, of weekend adventures, of the outdoors as something we visit and then leave. For the fur trappers who worked the Rocky Mountains between 1820 and 1840, there was no leaving. The wilderness was not a destination, but a home. And in winter, it was a home that was actively trying to kill them. Consider the conditions. In the high country where beaver were most plentiful, January temperatures averaged around 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was the average. Extremes plunged far below zero with brutal regularity. At higher elevations, temperature dropped approximately 3.5 degrees for every 1,000 feet of altitude gained. The mountain passes where trappers worked their lines remained blocked by snow from October through May, more than 200 consecutive days below freezing in many locations. And the 1830s were particularly cold. Tree ring analysis tells us that volcanic eruptions in 1831, 1832, 1833, and 1835 had pumped ash into the atmosphere, depressing temperatures across the northern hemisphere. The men trapping the Rockies during that decade faced winters that were colder than what their successors would experience for the next century and a half. Think about what this meant in practical terms. At 40 below, exposed water freezes before it hits the ground. Breath crystallizes in the air and falls as fine ice crystals. Metal becomes dangerous to touch. Bare skin sticks to gun barrels, to trap mechanisms, to anything iron or steel. The moisture in your eyes can freeze if you face into the wind. Your lungs ache from breathing air that cold. And this was the environment in which perhaps 3,000 men chose to live and work, sometimes for years at a stretch, hundreds of miles from any permanent shelter. They had no synthetic materials, no Gore-Tex, no nylon, no polyester fleece, no lightweight insulation that maintained its warmth when wet. They had wool, they had leather, they had animal hides, they had what the land provided and what they could carry on a pack horse, and they had knowledge that had been accumulated over generations by indigenous peoples who had survived these winters for thousands of years. The stakes could not have been higher. James Clyman, trapping with William Sublet's party in the Wind River Valley, recorded what happened when the system failed. Caught in a blizzard, separated from their main camp, he and Sublet found themselves without the means to build proper shelter. The cold was so intense that, as Clyman wrote in his journal, "The cold, hard, frozen earth on which we lay was still more disagreeable, so that sleep was out of the question." Worse was to come. When they tried to start a fire, the one thing that might save their lives, they discovered that their hands had become too numb to function. "As soon as our hands became exposed to the air," Clyman recorded, "they became so numb that we could not hold the flint and steel." Without fire, Sublet began to succumb to hypothermia. He seemed to have no life to move as usual, Clyman observed. He laid down nearly asleep. The drowsiness that precedes death by cold. Only Clyman's desperate efforts to find shelter and eventually, through extraordinary difficulty, strike a fire saved both their lives that night. This was the margin. This was how quickly things could go wrong. One failed fire, one night without proper preparation, and men who had survived years in the mountains could die in hours. The knowledge of how to sleep through these conditions was not theoretical. It was not optional. It was the difference between waking up and not waking up. And yet, they did wake up. Night after night, through winters that would empty a modern city, mountain men bedded down in open-face shelters and emerged alive in the morning. Understanding how they did it begins with understanding something most of us have never thought about: where the heat from a fire actually goes. Sit by a campfire sometime and pay attention. Your front gets warm, your back stays cold. Move around to warm your back, and now your front is cold. You're never comfortable all over. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's physics. And it nearly killed Osborne Russell during the winter of 1838. Russell, who trapped the Yellowstone country from 1834 to 1843 and left one of the most detailed accounts of mountain man life, described a night when he and his companions made a sort of shelter from the wind of pine branches and built a large fire of pitch knots in front of it. The result, he wrote with characteristic understatement, was that they spent the night burning on one side and freezing on the other alternately. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was a precise description of how campfire heat actually works. When you sit by a fire, nearly all the warmth you receive comes from one source: thermal radiation. The hot air from the fire rises straight up through convection. That's why smoke goes up, not sideways. That heated air is lost entirely to anyone sitting beside the flames. What reaches you is radiant heat, electromagnetic radiation that travels in straight lines, like light. It warms whatever it touches directly, but nothing else. This is why your front gets hot, while your back stays cold. The fire sends radiant heat toward you, warming your facing surface. But your back is in thermal shadow. No radiation reaches it. Meanwhile, the cold air around you continues to pull heat from every surface it touches. The result is exactly what Russell described: burning and freezing simultaneously. And here's the crucial detail that separates survival from misery. Radiant heat obeys the inverse square law. At 1 foot from a fire, you receive a certain intensity of heat. Call it 100%. Move to 2 feet away, and you're not receiving half as much. You're receiving 1/4. At 4 feet, you're receiving just 6.25% of what you felt at 1 foot. Every inch matters. Every detail of positioning determines whether you sleep warm or shiver through the night. The mountain men figured this out. Or more precisely, they learned it from Native Americans who had been solving this problem for generations, and they refined it through their own brutal experience. The solution was the reflector fire wall. And understanding why it works requires understanding just a little more about the physics of heat. Radiant heat travels in straight lines until it hits something. When it hits an object, one of three things happens. It gets absorbed, it passes through, or it bounces back. Dark, solid materials absorb radiation and warm up. Transparent materials let it pass, and certain arrangements can redirect radiation back toward its source, or toward wherever you want it to go. A wall of logs stacked behind a fire does something remarkable. Some of the heat that would otherwise radiate uselessly into the wilderness gets redirected back toward the shelter. The logs themselves absorb heat and then re-radiate it as they warm. The wall becomes a thermal battery, a reflector, and a windbreak all at once. And when positioned correctly, it transforms a one-sided heat source into something approaching a heat envelope. Modern testing has validated what the mountain men knew from experience. Field tests using digital thermometers have found that the temperature increase in front of a properly constructed reflector wall is roughly double the temperature reading to the side. More dramatic tests of enclosed shelters using the same principles have recorded interior temperatures of 68 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside air measured $30, a difference of nearly 40 degrees created by nothing but wood, flame, and intelligent positioning. One documented test pushed this further. Using continuous fire tending and careful shelter construction, a practitioner maintained an interior temperature of 60 degrees while the ambient air outside stood at -21. An 81-degree differential, survival conditions created in lethal cold using only the materials a mountain man would have had. The complete system that made winter survival possible combined three elements, each essential, each requiring its own knowledge and skill. A lean-to shelter angled at approximately 45 degrees. A reflector wall positioned 2 to 3 feet behind the fire, and a long fire burning parallel to both structures, its length matching the width of the shelter opening. Construction began with site selection, and this was where experience first separated the greenhorn from the veteran. The novice looked for a comfortable spot. The experienced man looked for a survivable one. Prevailing winds mattered above all. A shelter built facing into the wind would funnel cold air directly onto the sleeper and drive smoke into his face all night. A shelter with its back to the wind could catch gusts that swirled around the reflector wall and stole heat from the sleeping space. The ideal spot had natural windbreaks, a rock formation, a dense stand of trees, a hillside that deflected the worst of the air movement. Fuel supply came next. A night fire in sub-zero conditions consumed enormous quantities of wood. The experienced trapper looked for standing dead timber within reasonable distance, close enough that he wouldn't exhaust himself hauling fuel, dead enough to burn well, standing so it hadn't absorbed ground moisture. Green wood had its uses, as we'll see, but the primary fire required dry fuel that would catch quickly and burn hot. Drainage mattered too. Low spots where cold air pooled were death traps. Cold air is denser than warm air and flows downhill like water, collecting in depressions and valley floors. A shelter built in a hollow might be 10 or 15 degrees colder than one built on a slight rise just a few dozen yards away. George Ruxton, documenting trapper life in the Far West, described one man preparing his sleeping spot by drawing his knife and proceeding to cut drains round it to prevent the water running into him as he lay. Managing both snowmelt and rain runoff that could soak bedding and steal body heat. With the site selected, construction of the lean-to began. The basic frame required a ridgepole, a straight, sturdy branch lashed between two trees or supported on forked uprights at shoulder height, roughly 3 to 4 feet from the ground. This low height was deliberate. The shelter wasn't meant to be stood in. It was meant to trap warm air in the smallest possible volume around the sleeper. Poles leaned from the ridgepole to the ground at roughly 45 degrees, spaced close enough to support roofing material. And for roofing, the mountain man turned to what the forest provided. Pine boughs, layered 8 to 12 inches thick, shingled from bottom to top like a roof so that rain and snow would shed rather than penetrate. The back and sides could be similarly covered, creating a three-sided enclosure open only toward the fire. An experienced trapper could construct a functional shelter in 90 minutes. A novice might take 2 to 4 hours, and his would likely leak, sag, or fail to trap heat efficiently. The difference was knowing which branches to cut, how to weave them for stability, how thick the bough layer needed to be for adequate insulation. This was knowledge earned through cold nights and gradual improvement, the kind of learning that couldn't be taught, only experienced. The reflector wall demanded its own expertise. 10 to 12 straight poles, stacked horizontally between vertical stakes driven into the ground, created the basic structure. Height mattered. The wall needed to exceed shoulder level when lying down, high enough to redirect radiation toward a man's full length. Width matched the shelter opening, ensuring no heat escaped around the sides. Here, the choice of materials became critical. The veteran mountain man built his reflector from green wood whenever possible. Dry wood worked as a reflector, but posed a serious danger. Positioned too close to the fire, it could ignite, turning an asset into a disaster. Russell recorded at least one night when his shelter took fire, the logs being of pitch pine, and the blaze ran to the tops of the trees. Green wood was less likely to catch and served another purpose. It absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, becoming a thermal mass that continued radiating warmth even as the fire burned low. Alternative materials served when logs weren't practical. Rock formations could function as natural reflectors, and some trappers sought out campsites specifically because they offered stone walls that could be positioned opposite a fire. Earth banks, snow walls packed solid, even brush piles could redirect some portion of lost radiation back toward the sleeper. The geometry of the arrangement was everything. The sleeper lay at the center of a carefully designed heat trap. Direct radiation came from the fire ahead. Reflected radiation bounced back from the wall behind the fire. The angled roof captured rising warm air and held it in the small volume of the shelter. Cold air, being denser, stayed low, and the sleeper's position kept him above the coldest layer while remaining close enough to the fire for maximum radiant heat. The long fire configuration distinguished mountain man practice from the casual campfire most of us have built. Rather than burning in a concentrated pile, fuel was arranged along a line matching the shelter's width, 4 to 6 feet for a single sleeper, up to 20 feet for a group camp. This created even heat distribution across the entire shelter opening. No part of the body received disproportionate warmth while other parts froze. The radiant heat covered the sleeper like a blanket of warmth. Fire construction itself followed principles refined over centuries. Kindling and tinder at the center allowed for quick ignition. Larger fuel built up around the initial flames. But the arrangement that mattered most for overnight survival was something called the self-feeding fire. Logs positioned so that as they burned through, new fuel rolled down into the coals by gravity. This reduced the frequency of nighttime fire tending, allowing longer stretches of actual sleep between maintenance. Even so, maintaining fire through sub-zero nights required either constant attention or a rotation system. Brigades of trappers took turns on fire duty, waking every 2 to 3 hours to add fuel. Solo trappers developed a rhythm of half-waking, feeding the fire, and dropping back to sleep that became as automatic as breathing over a winter's worth of practice. The wood itself had to be selected with care. Dense hardwoods like oak, when available, provided 21 to 28 million BTUs per cord, heat that could be metered out slowly through a long night. Softwoods like pine offered only 12 to 20 million BTUs, but they ignited faster, burned hotter initially, and were far more common in the mountain forests where trappers worked. The experienced man gathered both. Softwood for quick starting when hands were too numb for careful fire building, hardwood for sustained heat through the coldest hours. Modern practitioners who have tested these techniques describe needing an astounding amount of wood for overnight survival fires. The general rule is to gather 3 to 5 times what you think you'll need. And that estimate comes from people who already understand what a night fire requires. For the greenhorn, the gap between expectation and reality was even larger. More than one novice trapper spent his first mountain winter learning, through shivering misery, just how much fuel a single night could consume. But fire and shelter were only 2 elements of the survival system. The third was something that sounds primitive until you understand its engineering: the buffalo robe. This was the mountain man's most essential piece of equipment, more critical in winter conditions than his rifle or his traps. A prime winter robe weighed 20 to 24 pounds and measured roughly 6 feet by 5 feet. Wrapped around a man lying by a fire, it provided insulation that modern users compare to adding 2 heavy comforters to a bed. And unlike synthetic insulation, it worked even when damp, maintained its loft under compression, and could last decades with proper care. The science lies in the bison's remarkable coat. Bison evolved to survive conditions as extreme as anything the Rocky Mountains could offer, from summer heat on the Texas plains to minus 50 degrees in South Dakota winters. Their adaptation was a double-layer coat unlike anything else in North American fauna. The outer guard hairs feature a hollow core structure, each individual hair containing an air-filled center that reduces thermal conductivity by approximately 1/3 compared to solid fibers. This is the same principle that makes modern insulated bottles work. Trapped air is one of the best insulators available, and the bison's coat traps it at the level of individual hairs. Beneath the guard hairs lies a dense inner down layer, the fine undercoat that kept the animal warm through the harshest conditions. These fibers measure 17 to 22 microns in diameter, comparable to fine wool, and create a second insulating layer that traps body heat close to the skin. The combination of hollow outer fibers and dense inner down meant that a buffalo robe could maintain warmth in conditions that would defeat wool blankets. Wool loses insulating ability when wet, its fibers matting down and losing the air pockets that provide warmth. Buffalo hide, with its natural oils and structure, remained effective even in damp conditions. The weight that made robes cumbersome to carry provided its own benefit: compression warmth similar to what modern weighted blankets aim to create. Properly maintained robes lasted generations. Museum specimens from the 1850s remain intact today, their fur still dense, their leather still supple. A trapper who acquired a good robe and cared for it properly might use the same one for his entire career in the mountains. But acquiring a good robe meant far more than killing a buffalo. The preparation process, brain tanning, transformed a raw hide into supple, durable leather while preserving the fur that made it valuable. And this process represented one of the most labor-intensive aspects of frontier material culture. The work began immediately after the kill, while the hide was still fresh. All meat and fat had to be scraped away, a task that required hours of careful work with a fleshing tool, removing every trace of tissue that would otherwise rot and destroy the hide. Then the hide was stretched and partially dried, allowing the worker to begin the thinning process. A buffalo hide in its raw state is thick, far too thick for flexible leather. Brain tanning required reducing the hide to half its original thickness, scraping away the inner layers until only the dense outer portion remained. This thinned hide could then receive the tanning solution: emulsified brain tissue, typically from the buffalo itself, mashed and mixed with water until it reached a consistency that could be worked into the leather. The brain contained lecithin, a natural compound that lubricates the leather fibers and prevents them from bonding back together as they dry. Without this treatment, dried hide becomes rawhide, stiff, inflexible, impossible to wrap around a sleeping body. With brain tanning, the leather remains soft and supple indefinitely. After the brain was worked into every fiber of the hide, the softening process began. 12 to 24 hours of continuous labor, working the hide over poles and cables, pulling and stretching to break up the fiber bonds and ensure that the brain had penetrated completely. This was exhausting physical work that couldn't be rushed. Shortcuts produced stiff spots that would never soften properly. Finally, smoking. The tanned hide was suspended over smoldering rotten wood, not a hot fire, but a cool smoke that penetrated the leather fibers without scorching the fur. 6 to 8 hours of smoking completed the process, sealing the leather against moisture and repelling the insects that would otherwise destroy it over time. Native American women who developed and perfected this process over generations could prepare approximately 10 robes per season. Each finished robe represented days of labor, and the skill required to produce a truly excellent robe took years to develop. Mountain men acquired their robes through trade with native peoples, recognizing both the value of the finished product and the expertise required to create it. For a trapper heading into a Rocky Mountain winter, the buffalo robe was worth more than gold. Gold couldn't keep you warm at 40 below. Gold couldn't mean the difference between sleeping through the night and freezing before dawn. The robe could. But understanding the method is only part of the picture. The real question is what it took to do this well, night after night, through months of winter, in conditions where even small mistakes accumulated into serious consequences. The difference between surviving a Rocky Mountain winter and thriving in one came down to details that couldn't be learned from description alone. It had to be lived. The details that separated competent survival from genuine mastery were subtle. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be written down because it lived in the hands, in the instincts, in the accumulated wisdom of nights spent learning what worked and what didn't. Consider the angle of the lean-to roof. 45 degrees was the standard, but the experienced trapper adjusted for conditions. A steeper pitch shed snow more effectively but captured less warm air. A shallower angle held heat better but risked collapse under heavy snowfall. The right choice depended on weather patterns, timber available, how long the camp would be occupied, and a dozen other factors that became second nature only after seasons of practice. Or consider the distance between fire and shelter. Too close, and sparks endangered the bedding, the shelter itself, the sleeper's exposed face. Too far, and the radiant heat dropped according to that unforgiving inverse square law. Every additional foot representing a dramatic decrease in warmth received. The sweet spot varied with fire size, wood type, wind conditions, and reflector wall construction. Finding it required constant adjustment through the night, a process that veterans performed almost unconsciously while newcomers shivered and shifted and never quite got comfortable. The positioning of the reflector wall involved similar calculations. 2 to 3 feet behind the fire was the general rule, but the angle mattered too. A wall that leaned slightly toward the fire, perhaps 100 to 110 degrees from the ground rather than perfectly vertical, redirected radiation more efficiently toward the shelter. The wall's height needed to match the sleeper's length, its width, the shelter opening. Too short, and heat escaped over the top. Too narrow, and warmth leaked around the sides. Fire tending through the night became a skill unto itself. The goal was maintaining consistent heat, not the roaring blaze that consumed fuel too quickly, not the dying coals that let the cold creep in. The long fire configuration helped, spreading heat generation across its length rather than concentrating it in one spot that alternated between too hot and too cold. But managing that fire required waking at intervals, reading the state of the coals in darkness, adding fuel in the right quantities to the right spots. Some trappers developed the self-feeding fire to an art, logs arranged on a slight incline so that as lower fuel burned away, fresh wood rolled down into the coals by gravity alone. This could extend sleep periods from 2 hours to 3 or even 4, a significant difference over a long winter. But building an effective self-feeding arrangement required understanding wood behavior, flame patterns, and the particular characteristics of available fuel. It was one more skill that looked simple and wasn't. The buffalo robe itself demanded proper handling. Wrapped incorrectly, gaps let cold air reach the body. Wrapped too tightly, it restricted circulation and actually reduced warmth. The standard technique involved folding the robe double as a ground layer. Insulation from the frozen earth was as critical as insulation from the air. Then wrapping a second robe or blanket around the body like a cocoon, with careful attention to covering the head, hands, and feet where heat loss was greatest. Rufus Sage documented the standard arrangement in his 1846 account. A single buffalo robe folded double and spread upon the ground, with a rock or knoll, or some like substitute for a pillow, furnishes the sole basework upon which the sleeper reclines and, enveloped in an additional blanket or robe, contentedly enjoys his rest. That word, contentedly, reveals something important. Sage wasn't describing desperate survival. He was describing a system that, when properly executed, actually worked, that allowed a man to sleep through a mountain winter night and wake rested rather than exhausted. The knowledge required to achieve that contentment was hard-won, but it was achievable. Thousands of trappers proved it, season after season. The sleeping position itself mattered. The fetal curl maximized coverage within the robe, minimized exposed surface area, and kept the core warm even when extremities cooled. Most trappers slept with their feet toward the fire, their heads protected by the shelter roof, their backs against whatever additional insulation they could arrange: saddles, packs, piled pine boughs. Scott Walker, a modern practitioner who recreates mountain man camps with traditional equipment, describes wearing his capote and mittens to sleep, the wool coat serving as an additional insulation layer, the mittens keeping hands warm enough to tend fire without losing dexterity to cold. And beneath all these specific techniques lay something harder to articulate: an acceptance of discomfort that most modern humans have never developed. The mountain men didn't expect to be comfortable. They expected to be uncomfortable but alive, cold but functional, tired but capable of working the next day. George Ruxton captured this philosophy in his description of the trapper Killbuck preparing for a rainstorm by declaring his intention to take what was coming at all hazards and anyhow. That fatalistic acceptance wasn't resignation. It was a clear-eyed recognition that comfort was a luxury the mountains didn't offer, and that energy spent pursuing comfort was energy wasted. What mattered was survival, functionality, the ability to check trap lines and process furs, and eventually return to civilization with enough beaver pelts to make the whole enterprise worthwhile. If achieving that meant sleeping in conditions that would horrify a modern camper, so be it. The mountain man didn't complain about what couldn't be changed. He focused on what could. Let's follow a trapper through an evening in winter camp. Not an emergency, not a survival situation, just an ordinary night in the extraordinary ordinary of Rocky Mountain winter. The day has been spent checking trap lines, wading through icy streams to retrieve beaver carcasses, resetting traps with hands so cold that fingers move like wooden sticks, hauling wet fur back to camp while watching the sky for signs of weather change. By late afternoon, the light is failing, and the temperature is dropping toward what will be another sub-zero night. Camp has been established for several days at a site selected for its combination of shelter from wind, proximity to beaver waters, and adequate fuel supply. The lean-to has been improved over successive nights. Additional boughs layered onto the roof, gaps in the walls filled with packed snow, the sleeping area lined with dry pine needles that provide a layer of insulation between body and frozen ground. The trapper returns to camp with the afternoon's catch. Before anything else, before eating, before resting, he addresses the fire. The long fire has burned down during his absence, maintained only by the bulk of logs he positioned that morning. He feeds it back to strength, adding fuel from the supply he's gathered over previous days, arranging the wood so it will burn evenly as night falls. Then the day's beaver must be processed. In winter, this is easier than in warmer months. The cold keeps the meat from spoiling and makes the fat firmer, easier to work with. The trapper skins each beaver with practiced efficiency, movements so ingrained that he barely thinks about them. The pelts are stretched on willow hoops to dry, positioned near enough to the fire for gentle warmth, but not so close that heat damages the fur. The carcasses provide food. Beaver tail, boiled to tenderness, is what Ruxton called the trapper's signature dish, rich with the fat that mountain living demands. Supper is simple and substantial. The mountain man consumed 5 to 7 pounds of meat daily, roughly 5,000 calories to fuel the relentless physical demands of trapping in winter. Bison cow was considered most delicious when available, but beaver meat served well, as did whatever game the day's hunting provided. The cooking method was equally simple: meat roasted over open flame or boiled in water, eaten with a bowie knife that served as the only utensil. As Ruxton observed, nothing in the shape of a fork must be used. With the meal finished, the trapper turns to preparation for the night. He checks the reflector wall, adding a log where the day's fire has burned the existing structure. He examines the shelter for gaps that might admit drafts, filling them with whatever materials are at hand. He gathers additional fuel, stacking it within arm's reach of where he'll sleep, so that feeding the fire won't require leaving the warmth of his robe. The light is nearly gone now. In winter, darkness comes early and stays late. 14 hours or more of night that must be slept through or endured. The trapper wraps himself in his robe, positioning his body at the optimal distance from the fire, his feet toward the flames, his back against the sloped rear of the lean-to. The buffalo fur is heavy on his body, a weight that feels protective rather than burdensome. The fire crackles and pops. Smoke rises toward the stars. He sleeps, not deeply, not continuously, but in the pattern that winter camping imposes. Periods of genuine rest interrupted by half-waking moments of fire tending. Every 2 or 3 hours, the cold or the dimming light penetrates sleep enough to trigger movement. Without fully waking, he reaches for fuel, feeds the fire, adjusts his position, and drops back into sleep. The rhythm becomes automatic after enough nights, a pulse of maintenance that keeps the system functioning through the dark hours. This was what winter looked like for the mountain men. Not adventure, not romance, but routine. The same tasks repeated night after night, the same cold endured, the same skills applied. The remarkable thing wasn't any single night, but the accumulation of them, the months spent living this way, the survival sustained through conditions that would break most of us in days. What would a modern person notice, transported to that winter camp? The darkness, first, a darkness without light pollution, without streetlights or glowing screens, a darkness so complete that the fire seemed almost painfully bright by comparison. The silence, broken only by wind, by the crack of branches, by the distant howl of wolves that reminded the sleeper he was not alone in this landscape. The cold, even wrapped in a buffalo robe, even positioned at the optimal distance from the fire, the cold was always there, not the killing cold of exposure, but a pervasive presence that never quite went away. Your nose was cold. The tip of any finger that escaped the robe was cold. If you shifted position wrong and created a gap in your covering, cold air found it instantly. The smell. Wood smoke, of course, but also animal fat, and the particular scent of buffalo fur, and the sharp, clean smell of pine boughs, and underneath it all, the smell of the trapper himself, months away from anything resembling a bath, his clothes saturated with the odors of his work. And perhaps, most of all, the utter isolation. The nearest permanent settlement was hundreds of miles away. If something went wrong, serious injury, sudden illness, a winter storm that buried the camp, there was no one to call, no rescue to hope for. The trapper's life depended entirely on his own knowledge, his own preparation, his own ability to solve whatever problems the mountains presented. Every night survived was a small victory. Every morning was proof that the system worked. The lean-to and reflector fire didn't exist in isolation. They were one thread in a web of interconnected skills that made mountain life possible, a web so extensive that pulling on any single thread revealed connections to dozens of others. Consider what had to be in place before a trapper could sleep warm through a winter night. He needed a buffalo robe, which meant either killing a buffalo himself, requiring hunting skills, firearms maintenance, knowledge of bison behavior, or trading for a prepared robe, requiring pelts to trade, which required trapping skills, which required knowledge of beaver behavior, trap construction, fur preparation. The robe's existence depended on brain tanning, a technique developed by Native American women over generations and passed to trappers through cultural exchange. He needed an axe or hatchet to cut poles for the shelter and fuel for the fire, a metal tool that had to be purchased at a trading post, carried hundreds of miles into the wilderness, maintained against rust and damage, sharpened regularly with whatever stones the landscape provided. That axe represented the entire industrial chain of iron mining, smelting, forging, distribution, a chain that ended at the frontier's edge and extended no further. He needed a knife for everything from processing game to cutting boughs for shelter roofing. He needed fire-starting materials, flint and steel, char cloth, dry tinder kept carefully protected from moisture. He needed clothing suitable for winter conditions, typically buckskin made from deer hides, also brain-tanned, also requiring extensive preparation. He needed moccasins that could be repaired with materials at hand, because manufactured shoes couldn't survive the conditions and replacements were years away. He needed knowledge of the landscape, where to find fuel, where cold air pooled, where water ran, where game could be hunted. He needed understanding of weather patterns, which clouds signaled approaching storms, which wind directions brought the coldest air. He needed familiarity with the animals he shared the mountains with, not just beaver, his quarry, but wolves and bears, and the bison whose robes he depended on. Each of these skills connected to others. Hunting required firearms, which required powder and shot, which required waterproof containers and careful rationing. Cooking required fire, which required fuel, which required the axe, which required maintenance skills and replacement handles shaped from suitable wood. Clothing wore out and had to be repaired or replaced, which required either trade goods or the skills to tan hides and sew buckskin. A single household on the frontier, or, in the mountain man's case, a single individual, had to encompass knowledge that modern life distributes across hundreds of specialists. We buy our food at grocery stores, our clothing at retail shops, our tools at hardware stores. We hire contractors to build our shelters and call technicians to fix our heating systems. The mountain man did all of this himself, or he didn't survive to learn from his mistakes. This was the self-reliance that modern audiences find both admirable and almost incomprehensible. Not the romantic independence of choosing to live apart from society, but the practical reality of having no choice, of being so far from any support system that everything had to come from your own hands and knowledge. The brigade system represented one response to this challenge. Most trappers worked not as lone wolves, but as members of organized parties. 8 to 10 men traveling together, sharing labor, providing mutual defense, rotating duties like fire tending and sentry watch. An elected leader, the boughs, from the French bourgeois, made decisions for the group. Each man contributed his skills to the collective. One might be a better shot, another a more skilled trapper, a third better at reading weather or finding game. This mutual aid extended beyond the brigade to the broader community of mountain men. At the annual rendezvous, the summer gathering where trappers traded their pelts for supplies, information flowed as freely as whiskey. Men shared knowledge of good trapping grounds and dangerous territories, successful techniques and costly mistakes. A piece of useful knowledge could save a life. Hoarding it served no one. Native American peoples played a crucial role in this knowledge network. Trappers learned shelter construction, fire management, hide preparation, and countless other skills from indigenous communities who had survived Rocky Mountain winters for thousands of years. The buffalo robe itself was a native technology, brain tanning was a native technique, and much of the geographic knowledge that guided trappers through the mountains came from native guides and trading partners. This wasn't a one-way exchange. Metal tools, firearms, manufactured cloth, and other goods flowed from trappers to native communities, integrated into indigenous material culture just as native knowledge was integrated into trapper practice. The mountain man world was not isolated from Native American life, but deeply entangled with it, a fact that the romantic image of the lone trapper often obscures. What the Lean-Tos shelter and reflector fire represented then was not just a survival technique, but a node in a vast web of knowledge, skill, trade, and mutual aid that made mountain life possible. Pull the thread of winter shelter, and you find connections to hunting, tanning, metalworking, firemaking, clothing construction, landscape knowledge, community organization, and cross-cultural exchange. The system worked because all its parts worked together, each supporting and depending on the others, and the system had to adapt. The Rocky Mountains are not one environment but many, and the techniques that worked in the high Yellowstone country needed modification for the desert Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, or the northern reaches of the Continental Divide. Timber availability was the first variable. In dense mountain forests, materials for shelter construction were abundant: pine boughs for roofing, straight poles for framework, green logs for reflector walls, standing deadwood for fuel. But trappers who worked the streams of the Great Basin or the edges of the plains faced landscapes with far less wood. Reflector walls might be built from earth or stone instead of logs. Shelters might incorporate natural rock formations. Fuel might be carefully rationed, the fire smaller, the buffalo robe's insulation relied upon more heavily. Snow itself became a construction material in some regions and conditions. Packed snow provided excellent insulation, better in some ways, than pine boughs, since it blocked wind completely and held its shape regardless of weather. Trappers caught by a storm sometimes dug snow caves rather than attempting above-ground shelter construction. The technique required different knowledge than lean-to building, understanding of snow layers, awareness of suffocation risks from blocked ventilation, skill in excavating a space large enough to occupy without causing collapse. Regional wood varieties affected fire management. In the northern Rockies, lodgepole pine burned hot and fast, excellent for quick warming, but demanding constant attention. Douglas fir provided steadier heat with less flame. In cottonwood country, trappers worked with softer, wetter wood that required careful drying before it would burn properly. Each species had its characteristics, its advantages and disadvantages, and the experienced man knew how to adapt his fire tending to whatever the landscape provided. Climate variations shaped practice as well. The northern reaches of trapping territory, what would become Montana, Wyoming's high country, the edges of present-day Canada, experienced more extreme cold but often drier conditions. The southern mountains saw warmer average temperatures, but more moisture, more wet snow, more rain mixing with the cold. A shelter adequate for dry cold might fail miserably in wet conditions. A fire arrangement that worked in one climate needed adjustment for another. Time evolved the techniques too. The earliest trappers in the Rocky Mountains during the 1820s were learning as they went, combining knowledge from Eastern woodland experience, Native American teaching, and hard-won experiment. By the late 1830s, nearly 2 decades of accumulated experience had refined the practices. Specific tools had been developed, specific arrangements proven superior, specific approaches to particular problems standardized. Some of these refinements emerged from individual innovation. A trapper might discover, through accident or experiment, a better way to position his reflector wall, a more efficient fire configuration, a technique for waterproofing his shelter. If it worked, he might share it at rendezvous, where it would spread through the trapping community. The knowledge base was continuously evolving, growing more sophisticated as more men contributed their experience. Remarkable individual examples dot the historical record. Hugh Glass's 1823 survival after a grizzly attack, mauled near the Grand River, abandoned by companions who believed he would die, crawling and stumbling 200 miles over 6 weeks to Fort Kiowa, demonstrates both the era's dangers and the resilience possible when someone understood survival fundamentals. Glass used every technique available, from finding shelter to managing his injuries, reportedly allowing maggots to clean his wounds of dead tissue, to locating food in the form of berries, roots, and a wolf-killed buffalo calf. Thomas Fitzpatrick's survival of a winter alone, after being separated from his party, became frontier legend. Hiding from Blackfoot warriors, evading pursuit, making his way through hostile territory with minimal supplies, Fitzpatrick drew on years of accumulated knowledge to survive conditions that would have killed a less experienced man within days. These exceptional cases represented the far edge of what the system could accomplish, but they rested on the same foundation as every ordinary night in winter camp: fire correctly built, shelter properly positioned, buffalo robe correctly wrapped, knowledge applied to circumstance. The remarkable survival stories were possible only because the everyday techniques were so thoroughly mastered. And then, quite suddenly by historical standards, all of it ended. By 1840, the Rocky Mountain fur trade had collapsed. Beaver populations, trapped relentlessly for 2 decades, had declined to the point that finding enough animals to make a season worthwhile became increasingly difficult. At the same time, European fashion shifted away from beaver felt hats toward silk, and prices that had once made a winter's worth of pelts valuable plummeted to $1 or $2 per pound. Hardly worth the time, as one trapper complained. Robert Newell spoke for the whole dying era when he addressed Jim Bridger around 1840. "We are done with this life in the mountains, done with wading in beaver dams and freezing or starving alternately, done with Indian trading and Indian fighting. The fur trade is dead in the Rocky Mountains." The transition was swift. Within a decade, the mountain man as a distinct way of life had essentially ceased to exist. Some trappers drifted toward the Pacific coast, trying their luck in California or Oregon. Others turned to buffalo hunting, as bison hide became valuable for industrial leather. Many became guides and scouts, their geographic knowledge suddenly useful to the waves of immigrants heading west on the Oregon and California trails. Jim Bridger established Fort Bridger on the Oregon Trail in 1843, transforming himself from trapper to trading post operator, selling supplies to emigrants and providing guidance through the mountains he knew better than any map. Thomas Fitzpatrick guided John C. Fremont's expeditions that helped open the West to American expansion. Kit Carson became an Army scout and Indian agent, his wilderness skills applied to very different purposes than trapping beaver. Their knowledge survived in fragments. The geographic information they had accumulated, much of it learned from Native American peoples, transferred to maps and emigrant guides. Some survival techniques were recorded in accounts like Ruxton's Life in the Far West and Sage's Rocky Mountain Life. A few skills continued in use among scouts and hunters who worked the frontier for another generation. But the intimate, embodied knowledge of winter survival, the feel of positioning a reflector wall correctly, the instinct for reading a fire's state in darkness, the judgment of when a buffalo robe was wrapped right, this knowledge faded with the generation that possessed it. You cannot learn such things from books. You can only learn them from practice, from failure, from accumulated experience. And once the conditions that required that experience no longer existed, there was no reason for new people to acquire it. Within 2 generations, the techniques were historical curiosities rather than living skills. Within 3 generations, they were barely remembered at all. The frontier moved on, became settled country, became states with cities and railroads and telegraph lines. Winter shelter became a matter of buildings rather than lean-tos, of stoves rather than open fires. The knowledge that had meant life or death for thousands of men became obsolete. What else disappeared with it? Something harder to measure than technique. A relationship with the environment that required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant respect for natural forces. The mountain man lived in negotiation with the cold, the wind, the availability of fuel and game and water. He had no buffer between himself and the consequences of his decisions. If he built his shelter wrong, he froze. If he managed his fire poorly, he froze. If he positioned himself incorrectly relative to heat and cold, he froze. That immediate feedback, that constant consequence, created a kind of knowledge that comfort makes unnecessary. We gained much in the transition. Heated buildings are more pleasant than open shelters. Modern insulation is more effective than buffalo robes. The average American no longer needs to know anything about fire management to survive the winter. Life is easier, safer, longer. But something was lost, too. Not romance, not nostalgia for hardship no one actually wants to experience. What was lost was a certain kind of competence. The deep knowledge that comes only from living so close to the edge that mistakes have real consequences. The mountain men knew things about fire and shelter and cold that we will never know, because we will never need to know them. Their world has vanished, and with it, the knowledge that world required. Today, that knowledge survives in unexpected places. Wilderness survival schools, Tom Brown's Tracker School, founded in 1978, NOLS, specialized programs across North America, teach versions of the Lean-To and reflector fire technique to students seeking skills their ancestors once took for granted. The students are not mountain men. They will return to heated homes and grocery stores. But for a weekend or a week, they experience something of what constant self-reliance required. Mors Kochanski, the Canadian bushcraft instructor who died in 2019, spent decades refining and teaching shelter techniques descended from frontier practice. His super shelter combines traditional principles with modern materials, clear plastic to create a greenhouse effect, mylar to enhance heat reflection. But the underlying physics remain exactly what the mountain men understood 200 years ago. Capture radiant heat, minimize its escape, create a microclimate that the body can survive. Modern testing has validated what the trappers knew from experience. The measurements confirm the temperature differentials, the effectiveness of reflector walls, the critical importance of positioning and materials. Science can now explain why these techniques work in terms of radiation, convection, and conduction. But the mountain men didn't need the explanation. They needed the result, and they achieved it through observation, experiment, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. What does their survival teach us? Perhaps that human adaptability is more profound than we often recognize. The mountain men were not superhuman. They were ordinary people, many of them young, many of them poorly educated, some of them running from trouble back in the settlements. What made them capable of surviving Rocky Mountain winters was not exceptional physical toughness, but knowledge, carefully acquired and faithfully applied. They learned from Native American peoples who had developed these techniques over thousands of years. They learned from each other, sharing information at rendezvous and in winter camps. They learned from their own mistakes, the ones that were survivable, and they passed on what they learned to the next wave of greenhorns heading into the mountains. The knowledge was collective, evolving, growing more sophisticated with each season of application. And they accepted discomfort as the price of the life they'd chosen. That acceptance might be the hardest thing for modern people to understand. We engineer our environments to eliminate discomfort: heating, cooling, lighting, insulation, climate control. The mountain men lived in an environment that offered none of those amenities and developed instead the capacity to endure what couldn't be changed. They didn't romanticize their hardship. They didn't complain about it. They simply dealt with it night after night until dealing with it became as natural as breathing. Picture one more time that January night in the Wind River country. The fire has burned down to coals. The trapper stirs, half waking in darkness so complete that he can see nothing but the faint glow of embers before him. Without conscious thought, his hand reaches for the wood he stacked within arm's length before sleeping. He places 2 logs on the fire, watches for a moment as flame catches the dry wood, feels the warmth increase against his face. Then he adjusts his robe, pulling it closer around his shoulders, and sinks back into sleep. In that moment, he performs actions refined over generations. The positioning of his fuel within reach, the selection of wood that will catch quickly from coals, the adjustment of the robe to eliminate gaps. Each detail represents accumulated knowledge, the solution to problems faced by thousands of men before him. He does not think about the physics of radiant heat or the inverse square law. He simply knows, in his hands and his instincts, what works. Outside, the temperature continues to fall. Stars wheel overhead in a sky unmarked by light pollution. Wolves call in the distance. Snow creaks as it settles and compresses. And in a shelter made of sticks and pine boughs, heated by fire and wrapped in the hide of a buffalo, a man sleeps through conditions that would kill most of us within hours. He will wake at dawn, shake the frost from his beard, and begin another day of work in the wilderness. He will check his traps, process his catch, perhaps move camp to fresh territory. He will face whatever challenges the mountains present with the same quiet competence he brought to surviving the night. And when evening comes again, he will build his fire, position his shelter, wrap himself in his robe, and do it all over again. This was ordinary life for the mountain men. Not adventure, not romance, but the daily reality of existing in a world that offered no comfort, no safety net, no margin for ignorance. They survived because they had to, because the alternative was dying, because they chose a life that demanded everything and gave back only the freedom of the high country and the earnings from their pelts. We have chosen differently. We have heating systems and insulated walls and sleeping bags rated to temperatures we will never experience. We have grocery stores and restaurants and food delivery apps. We have made ourselves comfortable beyond anything the mountain men could have imagined, and in doing so, we have made their knowledge obsolete. But knowing that it existed, knowing that ordinary people once possessed such competence, knowing that human beings are capable of adapting to conditions that seem impossible from our heated living rooms, this knowledge has its own value. It reminds us what we are capable of. It connects us to ancestors who faced challenges we can barely imagine. It suggests that if comfort ever became unavailable, we might find within ourselves resources we didn't know we had. The mountain men are gone. Their era lasted barely 2 decades, a brief flicker in American history. But what they knew about fire and shelter and cold, about adapting to the environment rather than controlling it, about surviving through knowledge and acceptance and sheer stubborn persistence, this has not disappeared entirely. It lives in wilderness schools and survival manuals, in the memories preserved by historians and the techniques still practiced by those who seek them out. It lives in the journals they left behind, in Russell's account of burning on one side and freezing on the other, in Sage's description of contentedly enjoying rest beneath the stars. And it lives in the simple, profound fact that they did it. That for 20 years, 3,000 men slept through Rocky Mountain winters in open shelters, and enough of them woke each morning to keep the trade alive. That human beings, equipped with nothing but knowledge and determination and buffalo robes, proved themselves capable of surviving conditions that the land itself seemed designed to make unsurvivable. They figured it out. That is the legacy. When everything depended on getting it right, they got it right. They learned what fire could do and what it couldn't, how heat moved and how to capture it, what the body needed and how to provide it. They lived, and in living, they proved what humans can accomplish when we have no choice but to accomplish it. The fire burns low. The night deepens. And somewhere in the memory of this continent, in the accumulated experience of all those who came before, a trapper settles into his robe and closes his eyes, confident that he will wake tomorrow, that his knowledge is sufficient, that the system works. It worked. That is enough.